Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, friends and foes, I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those who don't know any Arabic, that means may the peace and blessings of Almighty God be upon you all. Islam or atheism, which one is right? I will argue today that if we use the rational method of thinking, we will come to the conclusion that Islam is the right choice to make. In other words, atheism is irrational. This is why the famous Professor Edward Monte said, Islam is a religion that is essentially rationalistic in the widest sense of this term. Now, to argue that the belief in Islam is rational and therefore the right choice to make, I will use the following arguments. Number one, the belief in Islam makes sense of the origins of the universe. Number two, the belief in Islam makes sense of the nature of the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims. Now, before we start, let's discuss what we mean by rational. Now, we can have a lengthy philosophical discussion on empiricism and rationalism, a priori and a posteriori, but that would lose everybody. Let me give you a nice, crude but profound example. Now, imagine you are in your bedroom at 12 o'clock midnight and someone knocks on the door. And you quickly run saying, who could this be? You look through the spyglass and you see a man in his red underpants. And he says, hello, darling. I am here to check your gas meter. Now, would you believe that person, allow him in? No, you would use your rational faculties, your logic, your previous experience to at least call the gas company and say, have you changed your uniform policy? So I would argue that if we accept the atheist worldview or the rational foundations for the atheist worldview, it is equivalent of allowing a man in his red underpants to come into your room to check your gas meter. So let's use our rational thinking, our logic, and our previous experience to understand that Islam's intellectual foundations are rational and therefore the right choice to make. So let's go to the first argument. The belief in Islam makes sense of the origins of the universe. Now, brothers, sisters, and friends, we have all asked the same questions. Where did the universe come from? Why does something exist rather than nothing? In this light, the Quran, the book of the Muslims, says, or do they think the universe came out of nothing? Now, if we respond to this perennial question by positing a cause for the universe, I think it would be the best explanation. But if we posit that there is no cause, that is an absurd perspective, and it's the atheist perspective. For example, Bertrand Russell in a radio program said the universe is a brute fact. It's just there and that's all. But if that's the case, that would mean the universe is infinite, which would mean that the universe has an infinite set of historical events. But we know the infinite doesn't exist in the real world. And let me give you some examples for you to understand this. Example number one. Say we have an infinite number of Michaels in this room, and we take 5 Michaels away. How many number of Michaels do we have in this room? Infinity or infinity minus 5? Whatever the case may be, practically we should be able to count how many Michaels there are in this room. So infinity doesn't make sense in the real world. The philosophers call it, there is no ontological export of the infinite into the real world. Example number 2. Say we have 100 Michaels in this room, and every possible moment we add another Michael. Michael 101, Michael 102, Michael 1,000,001, and so on. Will I ever reach an amount of Michaels that we could describe as infinite? No, because we can always plus one more. So this shows us that the infinite doesn't have a basis in the real world. In light of this, the mathematicians Casimir and Newman, they said, the infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. David Hilbert, the famous German mathematician, he said the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. But past events are not ideas, they're real things. Therefore, the number of past events in the universe couldn't go back forever. It must be finite. So it necessitates the universe had a beginning in time. And if it had a beginning in time, it must have a cause. Now, all we conclude from this is that there is a cause for the universe. And it is supported by scientific evidence, astrophysical evidence. Everyone has heard of the Big Bang. Put your hand up if you heard of the Big Bang. Good. And it's all that thing that happens after too many curries, okay? Yeah? The Big Bang, which is also known as the hot standard model, states that physical time and space were created and matter and energy were also created, which cosmologists call at a point called singularity. This is why John Boswell, the author of Stephen Hawking's universe, states, the biggest misunderstanding about the Big Bang is that it began as a lump of matter somewhere in the void of space. It was not just matter that was created during the Big Bang, it was space and time that were created. So in the sense that time has a beginning, space also has a beginning. So from a naturalistic perspective, the Big Bang would then imply that the universe was created out of nothing. But, brothers, sisters, and friends, there is a key, undeniable philosophical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. This is why P.J. Zwart, in his publication about time, explains, if there is anything we find inconceivable, is that something could arise from nothing. Let me summarize the argument for you. Number one, whatever begins to exist as a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, and it logically follows, and it makes it a valid and sound argument, therefore the universe has a cause. However, all we can conclude from this is that the universe has a cause. It doesn't make it God, it doesn't make it Buddha, it doesn't make it Jesus, it doesn't make it Allah, and it doesn't make it Richard Dawkins. Oops, sorry. He's not a God, is he? But for some atheists, he is actually. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make, it doesn't make it anything that we know. However, we need to use another rational method of thinking called conceptual analysis, which basically means let's think very hard about this cause. What can this cause be? So, since this cause created time and space, it must be one. Because if we follow the philosophical principle of Occam's razor, which tells us do not multiply entities beyond necessity, it entails that this cause must be one. If we say this cause is 2 or 200 or 2000, it creates more questions than it answers. So the best explanation is that this cause must be one. Also, it must be uncaused due to the absurdity of an infinite regression of events, and similarly with causes. Let me give you an example. Say I wanted to shoot Michael, okay? And in order for me to shoot Michael, I have to ask permission from someone behind me, can I shoot Michael? And then that person says, well, I can't tell you because I have to ask permission to give you permission. If that goes on forever, will I ever shoot Michael? No, thank God, okay? Also, we know that this cause must be immaterial and transcendent, because since this cause created time and space, it must therefore transcend time and space. In other words, the cause exists atemporally and non-spatially. So the logical conclusion is that this cause must be immaterial because all material things exist within time and space. Significantly, brothers, sisters, and friends, this cause must have a will. Therefore, it can have a relationship with beings in the universe. Because if this cause is uncaused, therefore eternal, and it brought into existence a finite effect called the universe, it must have chosen the universe to come into existence, and choice indicates a will, and a will indicates it can have a relationship with beings in the universe. Therefore, upon conceptual analysis and using reason, we can conclude what the Quran and what Islam concluded 1400 years ago, as the Quran, the book of the Muslims says, say, He is Allah, God, the one and only, Allah the eternal, the absolute. He begets not, nor was he begotten, and there is none like unto him. Now, before going to the next argument about the Quran, I want to respond to some key atheist counter-arguments. The first one is concerning the quantum vacuum. Some physicists, they say that there are some subatomic events that do not correspond with causality. They claim that subatomic particles behave unpredictably and spontaneously in the quantum vacuum. So they can conclude that things don't always need a cause if they begin to exist. However, we can respond to this in the following way. 1. The claim is misleading because the quantum vacuum is not nothing. It is something. It is a rich structure that obeys the laws of the universe, and it is a sea of fluctuating energy. Number 2, there are many physicists that are adopting a deterministic view of quantum theory with regards to events in the quantum vacuum. For instance, the David Bohm interpretation being one of them. So we've dealt with that counterclaim. The next counterclaim, which is very embarrassing, I think, for the atheists, and even the famous atheist Michael Rules, he said, I don't believe atheists even say this, which is, who created God? Thinking they've undermined theistic philosophy. Now, the way we can respond to this is in many ways. Number 1, they are not attentive to our argument. We don't say everything has a cause. We say whatever begins to exist as a cause, and God, by definition, did not begin to exist. Fundamentally, to claim who caused God or who caused the cause for the universe is self-defeating. It denies our very existence. It does. Let me give you an example. If I say, who caused the cause that caused the universe, then why don't we say, then what caused that cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the universe? Then we could continue and say, well, what caused that cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused the cause that caused, and I could be rapping. I could be going on forever. And therefore, we will never have our existence in the first place. So the question denies the universe. So we've dealt with these outdated cliches. Let's go to the second argument, that Islam makes sense of the nature of the Quran. Now, when we probe and investigate the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims, we will conclude it is an act of impossibility. And this concept is in line with the coherent definition of what a miracle is. It's not a violation of natural law, rather it is an act of impossibility, which basically means that when we exhaust all possibilities in the natural world and still can't find an explanation, then it's a sign to the transcendent. It's a sign for the divine. And I will show this by discussing numerical, historical, and scientific statements in the Quran that render it an act of impossibility. Let's go to the numerical. Now, for us to understand this, we have to acknowledge that the Quran was a book that was revealed 1400 years ago. Many of its 6,000 plus verses were revealed instantaneously to address problems and concerns of the people. And this process was 23 years long. In light of this, how do we explain the numerical consonants of the Quran? In other words, the numerical coherence of the Quran. Take some examples into consideration. The word for world in the Quran is dunya. It's mentioned 115 times. The word for the hereafter is akhirah, and that is mentioned 115 times. Paradise and hell are repeated both 77 times. The words wine, al-khamr, and intoxication are repeated the same amount of times, 6 times. The words man and woman are employed equally 23 times. Also, if we take the second chapter of the Quran, which is the biggest chapter that was revealed over 9 years, it has 286 verses. If we go into the middle of that chapter, which is the 143rd verse, and we go to the middle of that verse, we know the word there is middle. So, since the Quran was primarily an oral phenomenon, and its verses were revealed instantaneously to address unprecedented events, how can we explain this phenomenon? We can't find a naturalistic explanation. The least we can say that it is extremely unlikely that an illiterate man from an illiterate people that had no computer technology could have produced such a work. Let's go to the second statement, the historical argument. Now, let me give you a particular example. The Quran mentions a description or label or title for the leader of the Egyptians. Al-Malik, the king, and Pharaoh, Firaun, in two distinct eras. The era of Joseph and the era of Moses, Musa, in the Arabic language, alayhi salam, peace be upon him. And we ask the question, how can this be the case? Why does the Quran differentiate between two particular times? We have to question this because this doesn't exist in any other historical document at that time, specifically the Torah and the Bible. And we didn't even have the Rosetta Stone to be able to translate the hieroglyphics to understand this was the case. But we know if we read any normal historical book or an encyclopedia, for example, Encyclopedia Britannica, we know that these two terms were used specifically in those two different eras. So in light of this, how could the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him, have known such historical detail, especially when all other religious texts and historical texts available at that time did not mention this? Since people at the time of revelation did not know this information, how could have this come from the Prophet Muhammad? The final one is scientific statements. Let's take, for example, how the Quran mentions the element iron. It mentions the iron in the following way. And we have sent down iron in which there lies great force and which has many uses for mankind. Now the key word here is sent down, which is the Arabic term is azalna. The literal meaning of this word means being physically sent down from the sky. And we know this to be scientifically true. Because from a scientific perspective, we have recently found out that iron didn't exist within the earth, it came down. It came down from giant stars out of space. For instance, Priscilla Frisch, in the article, The Galactic Environment of the Sun, states, an enhanced presence of this isotope, referring to iron, in a geological layer indicates recent nucleosynthesis of elements nearby in space and the subsequent transport to Earth, perhaps as dust grains. How can have the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, an illiterate man from an ummi, illiterate people, could have known such information? Let's go to the structure and function of mountains. Now the Quran mentions about mountains in various places. For example, it says, we place firmly embedded mountains on the earth so it would not move under them. In another place, the Quran says, have we not made the earth as a bed and the mountains as its pegs? This has only been recently understood by geologists in the 20th century. For example, in the book Earth by Dr. Frank Press, it states that mountains are like stakes buried deep under the surface of the earth. For instance, Professor Ciavida made the following comment in reference to the way the mountains have root-like structures. And the professor says, the fundamental difference between continental mountains and oceanic mountains lies in its material. But the common denominator on both mountains, that they have roots to support the mountains. And the functions of these are called isostasy, which is a geological term to indicate what the Quran has said, which is, so it would not move under them. So how can we explain this in light of the fact that it is relatively recent science, and no one at the time of revelation knew this information, or even remotely had the tools and techniques to understand this? What does it tell you about the author? Well, if we go back to our definition of a miracle, an act of impossibility, which we can't find a naturalistic explanation for the occurrence of these statements, then it's a signpost to the divine. So to conclude, we can argue that if the intellectual foundations of Islam are true, or we have good reasons to believe in them, then whatever Islam says is also true, because it's an undeniable key philosophical principle: whatever comes from truth is truth. Now, let me end with an emotional note, because Muslims are not abstract objects, we're not robots. Because the Quran is a very dynamic book that deals with the inner sciences, with the purification of the heart and the soul. It questions, what does it mean to be a human being? Are you just a product of your society? Are you just a product of social and political circumstances? Are you a product of Malaysia? Are you a product of Dublin? Are you a product of your own family even? The Quran is the only book that is very existential, makes you think about the self and who you are. Surely we're not just a product of these things. Because that would mean we're just like a robot. Someone puts the social biological code in and we act in accordance. The Quran elevates mankind. And this is why it profoundly asks these questions. As the Quran says, أَوَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. Do they not reflect within themselves? And to be honest, the atheist worldview, according to Islam, is not an intellectual doctrine. It's a spiritual disease. Because it's a rejection, not here, but rather here. And it's something we need to be honest about. And we would say it's a form of arrogance. Now, we all have arrogance, but it's a particular type of arrogance. And the Quran reminds us how to deal with arrogance. Remember your origins and remember where you're going. Your origins, you were a baby. You couldn't even lift your own neck, wipe your own backside, or feed yourself. Even if you go a bit more previous to that, we were a despised fluid. And now we think we could even reject the divine. Also, where are you going? The Quran says, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةَ الْمَوْتِ. Every soul is going to taste death. We're going to become worm buffet. That's the reality, people. And once we understand this emotionally, our arrogance and ego will drop and we may be able to accept some form of divine truth. Inshallah, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But let me talk about also life itself. Because without Islam, there is no ultimate meaning. Because if our ends are the same, if we pass out of existence, does it matter at all? Did it even matter that the universe existed in the first place? This is why postmodern philosophers, such as Arthur Schopenhauer, he would say, I wish the world would not exist. He even wrote an essay on suicide, because that's the atheistic paradigm. Because we're just matter, really. If you're a naturalist, we are just a rearrangement of molecules. And if we're matter, then does it really matter? And that's the profound point. But atheists don't want to talk about this. But this is the logical implications of their belief. Also, there is no ultimate value. If our lives end in the grave, does it matter if I lived as a saint or Michael lived as a devil? It makes no difference. Does it? That's why the atheists in Russia, they used to torture people and say, we're just going to become worms meat anyway. We don't have any divine accountability. I'm going to torture you and inject you with the AIDS virus and pull your nails out. This was the reality of the atheistic paradigm. It's a concept, and concepts have implications to actions. Also, with regards to atheism, there are no objective moral values. Michael is going to maybe, what he did on Monday, give you outdated cliches, generalizations, caricatures of Islamic law without any good scholarly foundation, and say these are wrong morally. How dare they even claim a moral truth objectively? Subjectively you can, relatively you can in the atheist paradigm, but if you want to be objective in your moral claims, you can't, because it necessitates God's existence. Because God is the only concept that transcends human subjectivity, that provides an ontological basis for objective moral values. This is why the late atheist professor J.L. Mackie, and I repeat, he was an atheist, in his book Ethics, he said, there are no objective moral values. Finally, there is no ultimate purpose. According to the atheist worldview, this life is purposeless, our underlying basis for life. Well, we can create purpose for ourselves, but I think that's a self-delusion. That we could give ourselves purpose, but our underlying existence, there is no purpose at all. This is why the existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre would say this world was based on nothingness and everything has no meaning. That's the implications of a materialistic worldview. Also, brothers and sisters, if we take the Richard Dawkins approach to purpose of life in his book The Selfish Gene, he says it's just to propagate our DNA. So therefore, he would never complain from a moral point of view why Muslim men can marry more than one wife. Because it's about propagating your DNA. Do you see? So, brothers and sisters, it is no wonder that the Quran says, respond to the call of Allah and His Messenger to that which gives you life. Because if you respond to the atheist call, do you really have a life? Or is it self-delusion? Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika. أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت واستغفر لك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.